The question came from across a kitchen table, between a pot of tea and a bowl of fruit that no one was eating, from a woman who had known me for 11 years and had apparently decided that tonight was the night she stopped being subtle. Her daughter was standing 2 feet away, holding a dish towel, and she went very still. Not dramatically still. Just inwardly still, the way you go when something has been said in the open that has only ever existed in very private silence. My name is Daniel Osei. I'm 34. I do building surveys, structural assessments, damp reports, the kind of work that takes place in quiet buildings and requires you to pay close attention to things other people have stopped noticing. I live in the same mid-terrace I've owned since I was 29. I cook adequately. I read more than I sleep. I have not, until recently, been someone who understood that the most important things happening in his life were happening while he was busy not acknowledging them. Miriam Holloway had been my best friend since we were 22 and had been assigned to the same section of a postgraduate induction week neither of us wanted to attend. She was studying architectural history. I was starting a surveying conversion. We had nothing obvious in common and had talked for 4 hours over terrible conference coffee about what we were each actually afraid of. That was 11 years ago. She still corrected my grammar. I still let her. The dynamic had never shifted. Except that it had. And I simply had not updated my paperwork on the situation. She had a copy of a building manual I'd lent her 8 months earlier that she'd marked up with yellow tabs, which she kept meaning to return and had never quite gotten around to. It sat on the edge of her bookshelf, slightly visible whenever I came over, and I had quietly stopped mentioning it, because the not mentioning had started to feel important in a way I couldn't account for. Her mother, Sandra Holloway, was a retired headmistress who had the particular quality of a woman who had spent 30 years in a room full of people trying to hide things from her and had stopped finding it convincing. She had always liked me. I had always known she was paying closer attention than she let on. The evening it happened, I had come over to help Miriam sort through a damp issue in her kitchen. Not a professional call. Just the kind of favor you do when you know what to look for. Sandra was visiting for the week. The 3 of us had ended up staying for dinner because the damp turned out to be manageable and there was lamb stew on the hob and no good reason to leave. The question arrived at the end of it, casually, between bites, the way genuinely dangerous things often do. So, Sandra said, setting down her fork with slightly too much deliberateness, when are you 2 going to stop pretending? Miriam and I both looked at her. I'm going to rephrase, Sandra said, not rephrasing at all. When are you getting married? There is a particular quality of silence that only exists when the thing everyone has been carefully not saying has been said by someone who owes it no caution. It is not uncomfortable, exactly. It is the silence of a room where the air pressure has changed. I looked at Miriam. Miriam looked at the dish towel in her hands. She laughed, but it came a note too high, and we both heard it. Mum, she said. I'm asking a straightforward question, Sandra said. And then Miriam looked up, and she did the thing I have replayed a significant number of times since that evening. She looked at me, not at her mother, at me, with an expression I had no language for. Quiet and slightly undefended, the way she looked when she was genuinely unsure of something and wasn't pretending otherwise. And she said, "Well, when?" She said it softly. She said it like she'd been holding it a long time and had only just decided to put it down in front of me. I want to say I handled this with composure. I want to say I understood immediately what was happening and responded with something considered and calm. I did not. I sat very still. I picked up my glass of water. I set it back down without drinking from it. My capacity for self-deception had been, up to this point, professionally grade, and it chose this particular moment to hand in its resignation. I should back up. Because what Sandra said in that kitchen was the end of something that had been building for considerably longer than one dinner, and to understand why that sentence did what it did, you need to understand what the previous 11 years had actually been. Miriam and I had a dynamic that was specific to us, and that I had always been able to label in ways that kept it manageable. We were best friends. We had survived each other's bad decisions, failed relationships, the period when I had strongly considered leaving London, the period when she had seriously considered leaving her PhD. A family bereavement that I will not describe, except to say that I was the person she called, and I drove to her immediately and didn't ask whether I was needed. We knew each other across time, across versions of each other, across every iteration of who we'd each been still becoming. This was easy to call friendship. It looked exactly like friendship. From the outside, it was indistinguishable from friendship. The problem, and I had been aware of this problem for longer than I was prepared to say, was that it felt like something that did not have a name I was willing to use. There was the time, 3 years ago, when she had introduced me to a colleague at a party as my person, and then immediately corrected herself to my friend with a fluency that suggested she'd run the correction many times before. I had filed that away and not touched it again. There was the night I had been on a third date with a woman who was clever and kind and genuinely good company, and had found myself thinking about something Miriam had said to me 2 weeks earlier about the particular quality of the light in November, and had understood that I was not fully present in the restaurant and that this was information. There was the contact name she had for me in her phone, which I had caught once when it lit up on her kitchen counter. Not Daniel, not Dan. The name was something else, something specific, and she reached for the phone fast enough that I had decided, for everyone's sake, to forget I'd seen it. I had a theory about what it said. The theory sat in the back of my mind and was not examined. The evidence was consistent, and I had been managing it consistently. What I had not fully reckoned with was what Miriam had been managing on her side. Her flatmate, Priya, had let something slip over dinner 6 months earlier. We were talking about an acquaintance of Miriam's who was getting married, and Priya had said, offhandedly, "Mim's already thought through the wedding, you know. She just hasn't sorted the groom yet," and then looked at me with the specific expression of a person who has said exactly 4 words too many. Miriam had redirected the conversation with such swiftness and precision that I had half admired it. But I had been thinking about it since, at intervals, in the way you think about something you have decided not to think about. And then there was the building manual. This is the thing I keep returning to, because it was the moment the theoretical became visible. I had asked her once, during a call about something entirely unrelated, whether she still had it, and she'd said yes, and that she'd been meaning to return it, and there was a pause in which I could hear her considering whether to say something else, and she didn't, and I didn't either. The pause lasted about 2 seconds. It contained more than 2 seconds worth of information. She wanted a reason to keep it. I wanted a reason to not ask for it back. We had, without discussing it, agreed on this arrangement. That is not the behavior of 2 people who are only friends. I had arrived at this conclusion privately, and had chosen to set it very carefully to one side and continue as we were. Because what we were was good and safe, and I knew how to operate inside it. And the alternative was a door I did not know how to walk through without the possibility of losing everything that mattered on the other side of it. This is what I was thinking about when I found myself sitting across from Sandra Holloway and her very deliberate fork. After Miriam said, "Well, when?" and the silence that followed it took up its residence in the room, Sandra stood up and said she was going to make more tea, in the tone of a woman who was going to give us 10 minutes and expected results. She picked up the teapot and went to the kitchen with the measured pace of someone who was very pleased with herself. I looked at Miriam. She was looking at her hands. She'd set the dish towel down on the table. She was turning a ring on her right hand in a slow, careful circle, something I had seen her do exactly twice before. Once when she was waiting for news from a hospital, and once when she had to tell me something she wasn't sure I'd want to hear. I knew it as a sign of something actual, something she wasn't performing. "You don't have to follow that up," I said. If you were just going with it. We can leave it where it is." She looked at me then, directly, and her voice when she spoke was very quiet. "I know I don't have to," she said. "That's not why I'm not." I went still. Not because of what she said. Because of the second clause. "That's not why I'm not." She hadn't said that's not what I meant. She hadn't redirected. She had told me exactly where she was standing, and she had stayed there. And my entire working model of the past 3 years was making a quiet, structural amendment. "I've been thinking," she said, and then stopped, and started again. "I've been trying to think of how to say this in a way that doesn't cost either of us anything if you don't. If it's not. Miriam, I've been thinking about this for quite a long time," she said. "And I'm tired of thinking about it and not saying it, and my mother is in my kitchen for exactly 8 more minutes, and I have run out of the energy required to pretend that any of the things I've been pretending are still true. This is not a feeling," I thought. "This is a feeling with considerably better paperwork than any feeling I've had before." "I know the shape of your thinking," she said. "I know you've been." She paused, considered, managing something. "The same way I have been. And I know that you know that I know. And I think we've both been very clever about it for a very long time, and I'm not interested in being clever about it anymore." She looked at the manual on the shelf. I followed her gaze. "I could have given that back 8 months ago," she said. "You could have asked for it. We both know that." "I know," I said. "So," she said. And then she stopped. She looked at me with the expression I had no language for. That quiet, undefended look that was not a performance, was not composure, was just Miriam without the careful layering she usually wore. She did not move. She did not look away. She was waiting. Not asking me to decide, just waiting to see if I was going to close the door or leave it. I left it. "I stopped thinking of Friday evenings as free time," I said. "At some point, I don't know exactly when, I started thinking of them as the evenings I see you. That was not a gradual thing. That was a thing I noticed and decided not to name." She exhaled, very slowly. "Every version of good news I've had in the past 4 years," I said. "You were the first person I thought to tell. Not one of the first people. The first. Before anyone else. Before I'd even understood what the news meant. You were just the first direction I turned in." She said nothing. Her eyes were very bright. "I don't know what that makes me," I said. "Except yours, I think. If that's something you want. I think I've been yours for considerably longer than I've been willing to say it." The kettle in the kitchen made a sound as it reached temperature. Miriam laughed. A real one this time, not a note too high, just a sudden exhale of something that had been held a long time and had finally found a place to go. She reached across the table and put her hand over mine, very gently, and we stayed like that for a moment that felt outside of ordinary time, the kind of moment that doesn't announce itself but that you know, while it is happening, is going to matter for a very long time. And then Sandra appeared in the doorway holding the teapot and looking at our hands on the table, with the expression of a woman who had 30 years of practice at knowing when a room had changed, and she said, with magnificent restraint, "So I'll pour 3 cups. Then Miriam looked at her and said, "Yes, please." And I laughed, and Sandra set down the teapot with the care of someone performing a very important task, and the three of us sat back down at the table, and it was smaller somehow. Warmer. The ordinary shapes of an ordinary evening, except for the thing that was now present in it that had not been present before. That was November. By February, we had stopped being careful about what to call it, because what to call it had become obvious to everyone, including us. She corrected my grammar at dinner, and I let her. And that had not changed, but the label on it had, and the label made everything feel lighter. She brought the manual back the first week of January. She put it on my shelf deliberately, with a small note tucked inside the front cover that said property of the above, returned in acceptable condition. I have not returned the note. 2 years later, when people ask how it started, we tell different versions. Miriam says it started when she decided to keep a book she could have returned. I say it started when I stopped asking for it back. Sandra, when anyone asks her, tells the version that involves the kitchen table, which is accurate and which she has polished considerably in the telling. What I know is that nothing appeared from nowhere. Everything that mattered had been there, in the space between two people who both knew and neither said, in every conversation that held more than it named, and every ordinary evening that carried more weight than evenings are generally supposed to. It had been there the whole time, patient, waiting for someone to stop being clever about it. We eventually stopped being clever about it. It turned out to be the best decision I have made with very imperfect information, which is, if I'm honest, how all the best decisions seem to work.